Good morning to 2,000 plus fellow feminist history nerds. Welcome to All About Women Festival. My name is Bri Lee. I'm a local author and one of the co-curators of this year's festival. It is my immense pleasure and privilege to welcome Mary Beard to her first ever visit to Australia.
I have to warn you guys that you've been so welcoming that I might just be back. And
We love to hear it. We love to hear it. To do my job properly, of course, Mary Beard is Professor Emerita of Classics at Cambridge and the Classics Editor of the Times Literary Supplement. She has worldwide academic acclaim, as proven here today. Wolfson Prize-winning Pompeii, Confronting the Classics, SPQR, Women in Power, and most recently, 12 Caesars. She has made numerous television series, and her books have been published in over 30 languages. Now, you will have the opportunity to ask Mary some of your own questions. We do that via Slido. So you should be able to see up there, you just go to slido.com. The passcode is concert hall. Something that's really great about the way Slido works is that if anyone hasn't used it before, it's very user-friendly, don't be afraid. You can go on to Slido and just see what questions other people have asked and upvoted them. So that way, when I come to the end 10 to 15 minutes, I can see if there's something that all 2,000 of you really want to hear that I haven't asked Mary. Mary, you are a classicist, and this is a feminist ideas festival. Is this book essentially the villain origin story of the patriarchy that we are all still fighting against?
I have had a bit of flack about this. Friends have come up, people at events have said, look, Mary, I thought, your USP was to talk about the ordinary people of the Roman world, the women, the enslaved, and here you are, writing a book called Emperor of Rome with a sodding eagle on the front.
Yes.
Right? Have you changed your mind? And my answer to that is an absolute no. I think one thing I wanted to do is to say, we think about the Emperor of Rome as a single, powerful, elite Roman man, right? As if he was ruling the world himself. Well, that's impossible. Nobody rules the world, even the Roman Empire part of the world, on their own. So you've got to look at other people, and you have to look at who he's living with. You've got to look at women and slaves and ordinary people. And I think that's true, and I think it's a good message to us, really, because I think for years I was taught, and then I taught other people, that we couldn't really know about women. We couldn't really know about slaves in the ancient world. And I think that's true in the sense that we don't have much big literature written by them, but the real reason that we think we don't know about women and slaves is we don't look for them. If you start looking for them, you find them everywhere. And, of course, because they were everywhere. And so one of the kind of ways that that's a feminist book is it says, I am using feminism to have a different perspective. And that's partly finding the women. But I think what feminism is great at is saying, look, history doesn't come just with one person's point of view at the top of the pecking order. You can think about what all this looked like from different perspectives. And in a sense, in the broad sense of the word, Emperor of Rome, paradoxically, is a feminist history of Rome. It should not be subtitled Ruling the Roman World. It should be subtitled A Feminist History of Rome.
We love it. We love it. That's also one of the reasons I think your work resonates with so many people who perhaps previously felt alienated by academia. When I was preparing for this, I was struck by this being the first in conversation where I a critical part of my preparation to speak to you was not just reading the books, but it was the podcasts and the documentaries and the things that are have so much of a broader appeal for people who have been alienated. And there is something inherently feminist about an approach that humanizes rather than mythologizes.
Yeah, I hope so. And I'm sure many of you recently saw the TikTok meme in which it was revealed that some blokes thought about the Roman Empire 15 times a day. I always try to upstage them, and I say, think about the Roman Empire all the time, right? But I think what, for me, was interesting about that was, in a sense, this plugs into your question, Bri. What are they thinking about when they think about the Roman Empire? What are those guys thinking about? And I tell you what they're not thinking about. They're not thinking about the women. They're not thinking about the ordinary. They're not thinking about the poor or the slaves. They are imagining themselves
as the Emperor
of Rome. Or, wearing, actually they've got to wear a silly little skirt because they're on campaign.
Yeah. But their calves are really good.
That's
so
right,
it's
really
fine.
And they're building bridges and aqueducts, and they're kind of wielding swords. And it's one of the things you want to say to them is, try thinking about this a different way. Just try. And I realised that in some ways this thinking about the Roman Empire thing, when I said, why do they do it? Why do they do it? And partly I think it is one of the few, I suppose I'm happy to say, one of the few remaining spaces, safe spaces for being macho. You can't kind of think about, 20th century empires and dictatorships and say, I think about them 15 times a day.
No.
You'd be cancelled. But you can, you can say, I think about Rome 15 times a day. And there you can be as macho as you like, and everybody gives you a kind of get out of jail free card. And I realized I was right because I put this on Twitter. I had X, sorry, she'll always call it Twitter, but I put this, I said, why are they doing this? I think it's because it's a safe space to be macho. I got a sort of mini pile-in from these blokes saying, oh, that beard is a really tedious old hag, isn't she? And I thought I was right then. I was right.
You just mentioned, in the answer to your first question, that you were not taught about the everyday people, and for a while when you taught, you did not teach about the everyday people. Do you think it's safe to presume that these dude bros would not be thinking about Rome and Roman Empire 15 times a day if they had actually been taught the reality of what?
My second rank, this meme, I have to say, went viral just at the time the book came out in the UK. And I first of all thought it was my publishers having a really brilliant PR job.
Yeah,
wow,
that publicist was in for a raise.
Really clever. Now what I try to say to them is, look, it's more interesting than you think. Oh, read my book, darling. But it's more interesting because if you add the other people back in, the Roman Empire is more colourful and it's more interesting and it's more problematic and more worth thinking about 15 times a day.
Something I really love that your work does in your latest book, but it's something that I think is in the DNA of all of your works, is that you can simultaneously critique the history, for example, of the Roman Empire, whilst also critiquing the sort of veracity or reliability of the records that we actually do and don't have. And there is, I was struck when I spent a long time with your work, so much fake news.
Yes.
So many historians throughout all of the centuries, dudes just making shit up.
They do.
Especially about women.
Yes, especially about women. I think that one of the things that I came to see, especially when writing this book about emperors, and partly because so much of what we think we know, in inverted commas, about emperors is anecdoted of the worst kind of fake news style. You know, what the Emperor Tiberius did in the swimming pool, or what particularly ingenious methods of murder, the Emperor Caligula worked out. And I started off by thinking, look, I've got to push those into the background because they're not true. I'm sure, I don't think that ever happened. We certainly couldn't prove it did or it didn't. But that instinct to kind of shift that stuff away lasted only, a couple of hours, really. Because I thought, it would be a very, very dull history of Roman emperor if you didn't have those anecdotes. But also, and more importantly, I think there's a basic rule of history that it took me several decades to see, which is that the fake news, the lies, the falsities that are told by the Romans or anybody about the ancient world, they are historically as important as the real stuff. So it's what people say, the fibs they tell, the prejudices they kind of parade. That's where you find some of the biggest truths of history, though they're not truths in a literal sense. And that does come out with the women, I think, that, I don't know if anybody here remembers Robert Graves's I, Claudius, or the BBC television version of I, Claudius, which I think is better than the novel, honestly, where, through the first 6 episodes, we are drawn to see the scheming figure of the Empress Livia, who is poisoning her way to the top, or rather she's poisoning her son's way to the top. She is trying, in the reign of Augustus, her husband, the first emperor, she's trying to make sure that her natural son survives to take the throne. And Graves had read a lot of classics, he'd done classics, he'd actually translated important works of Roman history. And he is absolutely embedded in that sense that many of us have inherited, I think, that behind the throne in the Roman Empire was a nasty woman who was pulling the strings, whether it's by incest with her son, like Agrippina and Nero, or, communal garden poisoning, like Livia. And I think that, in part, if somebody says, was she really like that? The true answer is I haven't a foggiest clue. Another answer is, well, I don't know how we would know. An old ancient history professor of mine used to say, one of the things about the ancient world is they could never tell the difference between a nasty case of appendicitis and a nasty case of strychnine poisoning, but they tended to assume it was strychnine, right? But then I saw, look, this is where the kind of feminist eye comes in, that those stories, true or untrue, and let's say untrue, they're told and retold, and they're as much part of the popular ideology in antiquity as they are now. And why are they told? Well, there's a basic misogyny in history writing.
Understatement of the last 2 centuries.
Basic misogyny, a slight touch of sexism, in history writing. And even the ancients themselves sort of recognized this when they were writing. Particularly, Rome has moved from a fairly sort of open democracy to, with the Emperor Augustus, things being decided behind closed doors. What then happens is that it is true that women, because they're close to the emperor, like some slaves or some servants of any sort, get a sort of day-to-day power. They get influence over the emperor. But more to the point, nobody can really see any longer how decisions are made or what's happening within the palace. And so the easiest patriarchal trick in the book is to say it was all Livia's fault, right? And that is what they proceed to do. And we go on doing it. It's not as if this is just the Romans having a sort of touch of misogyny. I was really, really struck recently when the UK was having its COVID inquiry to see if quite how competent or incompetent Boris Johnson had been. At the inquiry, all on oath, civil servants, lawyers, one of the commonest reasons they had for explaining why Johnson had done what he did was to say that it was Carrie Johnson, the wife, who had urged him to do that. Absolutely. So the oldest trick in the historical book is to blame women, for why men fuck up. And we can see that from the beginning as far back as we can go to now. I've got no idea whether Carrie wanted those dogs brought home from the, I just have no clue. But
do you feel, does it bum you out? Does it frustrate you as a historian, looking back through all of these versions of history at the people who were previously doing the job you do now, seeing how consistent those prejudices and mistakes keep repeating?
I think I do. I sometimes feel cross. I think, couldn't you just open your eyes? Couldn't you just look? Because, as I said, it's not that there isn't any evidence for other kinds of things and other kinds of people. It's just people have chosen not to see it. I think that when one looks at one's predecessors, however, a little bit of modesty is not a bad idea. Because if you're a historian and you're busy dumping on your predecessors, I think it's a good idea to think why your people who come after you are going to be dumping on you. And I think it's always a good idea to say, why are they, how are they going to say, God, Mary Beard was so trapped in an early 21st century vision of power, right, that she wrote that book, right? Why didn't she see? And, I think we stand on shifting sands, I think.
I love the sass in particular that comes through in your refusal to refer to Marcus Aurelius's work as meditations, instead referring to them as his jottings to himself. Please explain.
I am now going to get into terrible trouble because I always get into terrible trouble when I talk about Marcus Aurelius, and I want to preface this by saying opinions in the scholarly community on Marcus Aurelius differ, right? Okay? I find him extremely interesting in all kinds of ways. I'm interested in Roman emperors. I think about them a lot. One of the things I can't understand is why Marcus Aurelius, emperor at the end of the 2nd century, who did, in some way, we don't quite know how, circulated his kind of philosophically inspired notebook, is what it is, jottings to himself, which has come down to us normally with the title Meditations. That makes it seem frightfully kind of profound. Now, you might say, I think it's jealousy. Marcus Aurelius, 2,000 years later, is well outselling Mary Beard. Well outselling. I checked him out on the Australia Amazon rankings. He's number 33 of all books this morning on Australian Amazon. And he's pretty good. He's not quite as good in the UK, but he's up there. Now, so I can't quite work out whether I'm pleased at this or hugely annoyed. But it is a real problem. I think for me, and I say some of my colleagues were different on this, Marcus Aurelius's jottings are the worst kind of self-help cliches that you can find almost anywhere. Now, I'm going to give you a parody. It's not exactly
Tech
right.
bros around the world just got like goosebumps on their arms and they don't know why.
But there are things like, when you get up in the morning, think carefully about what your priorities are for the day. Right? Not a bad piece of advice, but not to go up to number 33 in the Amazon bestsellers in Australia. And I am curious about it. And I think in different ways, there is something hugely appealing, and I pay tribute to this, really. There is something hugely appealing about having things a Roman emperor 2,000 years ago thought and wanted to say to himself. That is, people say, and I've mentioned this before, not just that we don't know anything about the women and the slaves and so forth. People say it's such a pity that there's so little evidence for ancient Rome. No, there isn't. We got the jottings of Marcus Aurelius for a start. And I think that partly explains why it is said President Clinton had these jottings on his bedside table. I mean, God knows what he did with them, but, but Clinton I think, is a rather benign reader of Marcus Aurelius, and probably didn't pay very much attention.
You think he did actually read them? I just thought he put them.
They're on it's a good thing. It's a good look on the bedside table.
Yeah.
The ruler of the Western world reads the ruler of the Western world 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? There is a kind of nasty sense that, and this may fit with the how often do you think about the Roman Empire meme, there is a slightly uncomfortable sense that Marcus Aurelius' particular version of philosophy, he's broadly speaking what we'd call Stoic, has sort of got a bit corralled by the conservative right, the culturally and political conservative right, as to be a kind of version of what it is to be a steadfast, sword-wielding man, right? There's a kind of masculist tendency sort of in there, or that's how it's read. I mean, probably it's doing Marcus Aurelius himself a bit of an injustice, but
it also has there's that flavor of, individualism, and this idea that you can determine your own life by the power of your thoughts, that just is particularly repellent to issues of systemic inequality.
That's putting it very kindly, Bri. I think, my guess is, to put it a bit more fundamentally, and frankly, I bet Jordan Peterson really does read it.
Yeah.
And so there is a kind of sense there of it's an every man for himself kind of version of survival in a difficult world.
You've touched on, I want to go now, this is a perfect segue to this idea of the West. And this is a feminist ideas festival, but in particular, I want to talk about the way conservative leaders and conservative thought leaders and speakers and commentators have, I think, sort of really, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years in particular, latched onto this idea of the West with a capital W. And I just have brought a couple of quick examples. I was reading FT Weekend last weekend, and the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, so certainly a leader in his space, was reviewing a book called How the World Made the West by Josephine Quinn, and finished by saying, sort of critiquing the fact that most of the people in Generation Z in the UK would refuse to serve in the armed forces in the event of a new world war. And I quote verbatim, if, on the other hand, I was taking shelter in Kiev, fearing another wave of barbaric Russian bombardment, I think I might be hoping that the West did retain some sense of a historic identity and purpose in the world. And then we have one of our recent former Prime Ministers, Tony Abbott, who's...
I wonder what he's going to say.
Yeah. So in defense of the establishment of something we have here now, unfortunately, called the Ramsay Center for Western Civilization, he said, and he's published this is available online, the study of history he's lamenting the fact that the study of history was no longer narrative, starting with the cradle of civilization and moving through Greece and Rome to the story of England and the birth of the modern world, its triumphs and its travails. Instead, it had become, this is the teaching of history, had become episodic. Every element of the curriculum was supposed to be pervaded by Asian, Indigenous, and sustainability perspectives. Almost entirely absent from the contemporary educational mindset was any sense that cultures might not be all equal and that truth might not be entirely relative.
That could have been written in 1750.
Yeah.
Actually. Huh?
And then just the very final thing, on the Ramsey Center for Western Civilization's website, on the About Us, they have a picture of liberty leading the people from the French Revolution, even though they're all rampant monarchists.
Yes. It's very...
So my question is, has this idea of the West become an almost like kind of almost meaningless chimera? And it just gets wheeled out in defense of any status quo, of any conservative argument.
I'm, by and large, yes. I'm going to caveat this in the end with one thought, but it's one of the sloppiest ways of talking about who we, in inverted commas, might think we are, and what we think, again in inverted commas, what we think our values are. And to put a capital W onto West, and then, and this is where it gets very awkward for a classicist, then to trace a kind of evolution of Western thinking. And where does it begin? Well, it begins in Greece and Rome. And that's where you start to see, and it's a bit like the keenness on Stoicism, you start to see the idea that that peculiar love of truth and civilization and beauty starts probably in about 500 BC in Athens. Now, you only have to think about that argument for half a second, to see that, so you mean other people don't like truth? They're kind of keen on lies, aren't they? They like things to be false and ugly, Sorry, guys. And so you have this notion, and I said 1750 for Abbott, that's about right. That's when this kind of view starts to take shape. And I think one of the best critics of this is Kwame Anthony Appiah, who uses a lovely image of Western civilization like a nugget. It's a golden nugget. And this golden nugget gets passed from Greece to Rome. It then kind of goes perhaps to Paris. It goes to London next, and it ends up now at Harvard, right? That's where Western civilization. Now, none of this, I think Josephine Quinn's recent book, How the World Made the West, is a very good example of unpicking this. Civilizations don't work like that. There isn't such a thing as the nugget which gets passed around. They're always in dialogue. They're always talking to each other. And you don't need to project backwards to men in skirts in fighting the Persians in the 5th century to see where you came from. We is always a very dangerous word in history. We came from all kinds of places, and the Roman Empire was multicultural to a degree that most modern history is not recognized. The idea that Romans were, elderly white men in togas with white skin and orating, that is not how Rome was. And I think it's a self-serving image. It enables us to feel feel what Abbott does, I suppose. I think I said to have one caveat about that. I think it would be naive to think that different cultures around the world, they both want to celebrate, and they do celebrate, their mutual influence. They also do want to say, so am I different? What's different about me? So we're always building bridges between one culture and another, and then saying, but no, in England, we're not like the French, or whatever, And I always come across this when I'm trying to write, and I think people will, when they read Emperor of Rome, they'll find the word West in it. That's, I hope, I'm using kind of deferentially and modestly, because it's very tempting to say, you know, Virgil's Aeneid has, there has never been a day, this is true, there has never been a day in the history of the world where somebody since 19 BC has not been reading the Aeneid, right? That's why that work is so important. You don't have to say, but they weren't reading it in China, right? They weren't reading it in Japan, and they, for most of the time, were not reading it in Australia. And so I think you have to see that West is, in my language, is partly a way of saying, you know, don't let's imagine that these emperors of Rome have got any importance outside a particular rather fluid set of territories. We'd gone to China in 100 CE. The Roman emperor might have been known about, probably was. There is contact between Rome and China. But, you know, the Chinese are not saying, God, Roman culture's great. So I wish we were a bit more like them, right?
That Marcus Aurelius.
That Marcus Aurelius, blimey, we could do with a few more of him. So, you know, I think we have to do a both and here. I mean, it is self-serving. And it almost always comes with a kind of hierarchy, you know, where there's the West, whatever it is at the top, and then everybody else is trying desperately to get there. I hope that I use it as a way of saying, look, don't let's assume that Western values, greatest hits, Western classics, are the same as anybody else's classics. We ought to be a little bit modest about it. But I don't think that's what Mr. Abbott has in mind. Sadly.
I want to pivot and talk about this extraordinary work. So I had the original version, it's Women in Power. It was 2 speeches that you delivered at a pair of London Review of Books events. The original edition came out in 2017, and then you published them, obviously, as essays, and then a slightly updated version came out the year after. I was in Egypt 2 weeks ago, and at Hatshepsut's temple, she depicted herself wearing a pharaoh's beard. And in the records that she was in control of making herself, on the historical record, referred to herself in masculine terminology as pharaoh or king.
Yeah.
What, in particular, points were you looking to explore in these essays about what history tells us about women being excluded from versions of power?
Well, I think she's quite a good example of that. I do not question me on the Slido about Egyptian history. Bri probably knows more about this than me.
Yeah.
But what struck me when I started to think about how women have any kind of investment in power, in decision-making, in being listened to, there is almost no popular shared image of what a powerful woman looks like. And if you shut your eyes, we can do what a powerful man looks like, and I'm pretty certain that we would all come up with, we would cluster around the same image. We don't know what powerful women look like. In fact, we don't hear their voices as powerful, and we don't see their dress as powerful. Interestingly, I might start to analyse this extremely nice outfit, a lot smarter than mine. But I started to go through just images I could find of powerful women on Google Images from newspapers. And if you want to be a powerful woman, taken to be a powerful woman in the sphere of politics in particular, you have to pretend to be a bloke. And there's a wonderful picture I put in the book, which I found utterly by chance, of Hillary Clinton and Angela Merkel. And they're both wearing much less elegant trouser suits than Bri's got on. They're both kind of standing there facing each other in the same outfit. And I'm sure if you asked either of them, they'd say, well, it's very convenient, if you're on the go all the day, and if you've got photographers photographing you from unlikely angles, trouser suits a very sensible thing to wear. But basically, they are claiming authority by by dressing as close as they can to male dress without actually cross-dressing. And the same goes for voice and sound. And one of the most notorious things about Margaret Thatcher was that she took elocution lessons specifically to lower her voice, to make it sound more male. And it's fascinating. You can go on to, you can search the web for early speeches of Thatcher, and she's really speaking frightfully kind of up here. You know, by the time she's done her elocution lessons, you could not tell her voice from a male voice. She's interesting in some ways, I think, because she really kind of went into masculinity that way as a marker of power. I think that, I couldn't stand Thatcher, but surprisingly, I know that's...
We're shocked.
Yeah, God, that's a headline, isn't it? What I thought she was quite interesting in doing is that she did manage to turn one item of female equipment into a symbol of power. I mean, i.e. the handbag. It's so that in the UK English, even for a short while became a verb. She's going to handbag him, all right? And I had to admire her for that, because the handbag is something which really, I think, is a ball and chain for women. They've always, look, I've got mine here. Where are you going to put it? You haven't got enough pockets. It's like stiletto heels. The handbag is an imprisonment. Thatcher managed to turn it into a weapon. So I think we've got one thing to thank her for.
There is also a particularly pernicious way that ageism and sexism interact, and I want to bring that back to this idea of power that we have, in a lot of ways, sort of inherited from our sort of cultural legacy, and these are the arguments you make with Roman emperors. It is interesting that Trump is currently 77 and Biden is 81. And if I imagine a woman in her late 70s or early 80s attempting to run for any position of leadership, she would be not only discredited, but I think it's fair to presume scornfully laughed at.
Yeah.
What is the image of power that we have from the time of the emperors, from the Caesars, that allows men as they age to become, to gain gravitas, whereas women only lose it?
I mean, this is something where, you can't blame the Greeks and Romans for this, but you can see an inheritance from the Greeks and Romans. And it went without saying at Rome that old men had authority. What does the Senate mean? It's a council of old men, senes, right? Conversely, women's function was simply to have babies. There was nothing else that a woman was basically for, apart from producing, hopefully, male heirs. And once she was incapable any longer of producing a baby, there wasn't much function for her. And in, ancient culture, old women were ridiculed, much as they are, or as they still sometimes are, as kind of witches, old crones, drunken, because they haven't got anything to be for any longer. And I think that we're still using those cliches about men and women growing older. Now, I want to say, I have retired. I'm 69. I retired when I was 67. I was very pleased to retire. Part of the reason I wanted to retire is I thought it was time for the baby boomers to get out of the way and let some of the younger people get a job and get in and do something, right? And I'd been in Cambridge 35 years, and if I hadn't done what I wanted to do in 35 years, 5 extra years wasn't going to make much difference, frankly, right? And I had other things to do. But you still see, and I think it's a perhaps under-recognized bit of prejudice. You still see, and you can see this on television, the wrinkly old man who's presenting the news with gravitas and authority is still much revered. The wrinkly old woman does not have much of a place. And there are two things, I suppose there are 2 ways in which I hope I've done a tiny bit to chink away at that. And the first was actually being on telly at all. I haven't, thank God, I've only done it since I was in my mid-50s, and I say thank God because I think it would be awful, just awful to kind of rely on television as what you did. I'm an academic who does a bit of telly. I nearly said no, when somebody in the BBC, Janice Hadlow, a senior person at the BBC, said to me, I'd like you to make a programme on Pompeii. I said, it's so time-consuming and I don't think I'll be any good at it, etc., etc. And she said, look, I've seen you write things which says it is deeply unfair that wrinkly old men go on being on telly and wrinkly old women don't. I'm now saying go and be on telly and you're saying no, right? Get real. Right, so snookered, absolutely snookered. So I said yes. And it turned out, it's another story, I quite enjoyed it. I did not go down wholly well with traditional television critics. And there was one particular one in the Sunday Times who said, God, I wish you could she ought to keep out of our living rooms or do something to brighten up her appearance. And, she looks, 15 from behind and 95 from the front. I mean, it just went on and on. Couldn't she fix her teeth, etc., etc. And it was basically a kind of string of ageist stuff. I was kind of sort of feisty enough, I suppose, to think I would reply, but I decided not to reply in, the nice left-wing Guardian, because I thought nice left-wing Guardian will agree with me, So I thought I wrote an article for the Daily Mail with in which I said something like, what does this guy's name, A.A. Gill, what does he think 50-year-old women look like? They look like me, right?
He doesn't know any, is the answer to that.
I'm afraid that's...
Yes.
But so I did this, and I thought, once it'd been published online, I would dare to look under the line. I thought that I would find a load of absolute vitriol, right? And A.A. Gill is right. What a nerve that old hag has got. She ought to get back to her cats, right? That's, now there was a bit of that. There was a bit of that. Mostly, and it's interesting, the Daily Mail's demographic is quite heavily female. They were mostly saying, what an awful guy that is. We want to see women like Mary Beard on our screen. And as I read this, not only did I think, I slightly got a bit too pleased with myself, but I thought, why is it? I expected this to be an absolute nightmare of attack. I thought, the people who are writing this, they're 50-something women, and they know that when he criticizes me, he is criticizing them. Yeah? And they know they don't see themselves on television, and actually they might be sort of conservative Daily Mail readers, but they're not necessarily stupid, and they can see the lie of the land. And it was really, really encouraging. And I think that, it is very strange. I shall stop and let you get on, Bri, because we've got to move.
What?
But,
no.
But, I think I've just became more and more puzzled. Why is it, when you get to my age, that it's taken as a compliment if somebody says, you don't look 69? Why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I look 69? I am 69, guys.
Yeah.
You know, why shouldn't I look it?
Can you talk about, I think one of the other reasons that somebody like A.A. Gill or like douchebags in general don't like seeing you on television talking about Pompeii is because it comes back to this idea that you touch on in Women in Power, that maybe somebody who looks like you can talk about women's business, but that someone who looks like you shouldn't be talking about ancient history or Pompeii or whatever it is.
That's right.
What does Hortensia's story explain for us about that?
Right. Well, there is a famous story from the period in Rome between the Republic, free republic, democracy, and the empire. Civil war, it's a public spending crisis in Rome, basically, and the junta then in charge decides to have a wealth tax in order to finance the war. You know, we know about this. And they decide to tax the elite women by demanding their jewelry. And this is not a story about the working class in Rome, by the way. It's all very posh. But Hortensia, who is the daughter of a famous male orator, gets up in the public space, in the forum, and says, basically, no taxation without representation. Not quite as snappily as that, I have to say. And she defeats the motion. Her words mean that this tax on women is put on hold. She is, in women's terms, a heroine for speaking out. I think that one has to be a bit careful about this, because in a sense, as you say, the A.A. Gill problem was that I wasn't staying in my box. If I'd done a program about old Roman women, he would have been fine. Mm-hmm. It was that I was spreading myself a bit more widely. And that basic notion fits with Hortensia and several other famous interventions by women in the Greek and Roman world. When women are allowed to intervene in order to defend themselves or to protest their own victimhood. Women are allowed to speak after being raped. They are allowed to protest at women's, in this case, women's jewelry being taken away. That they can speak on women's issues. Now, I think that we have a bit of that, that in the British Parliament it's changed, but, 30 years ago you could find women being Minister of Education or Minister of Health, but not Minister of Defence, right?
And never, ever Treasurer.
Not yet. It's going to change. I promise you, in a year's time, you won't be able to say that. Cross fingers. And I think in some ways that's kind of, and that's depressing. Mm-hmm. The big speeches, the big interventions by women in antiquity, and actually throughout history, honestly, have been about women's issues and women's victimizations. I've perhaps changed my mind a little since writing Women in Power, because I now think, I think that's true. I think it's, this is not a sign of women taking control. I've come to see, I think, and this is perhaps the optimistic ending, that patriarchy is more fragile than we think it is.
Ooh,
it's got lucky. It's got lucky for thousands of years. I have to accept it's got lucky. However, I think that it does constantly have to look and accommodate stories in which women are powerful. Now, in part, that is used, to justify the patriarchy. You don't want women in power because look at what they do, when they get it. But partly, these stories are always picking away at some men's, Tony Abbott here, not other people, right? Some men's certainty of how the world works. And I won't live to see it. which is a pity because it would be nice. But things are changing and they will change. And in some ways, the story of Hortensia is a kind of glimmer that maybe women can take control. Barbie would be another example of that, I think.
I have one more question for Mary, and then I am going to feed her audience questions. So if you have not already, have a look at the Slido. A lot have come through, a lot of people upvoting, and you can also, can you downvote? I don't know. But you should upvote for sure. Something I would love to finish on is a version of a way forward, and you've already sort of started taking us there. A phrase that appears in Women in Power is the idea of conceptualizing power as a verb, rather than as something that only is in a limited supply, that only a limited number of people can sort of attain and hold on to as a resource. What do you mean by that?
I mean that language, the way we talk about things, often without thinking, is hugely diagnostic of how we see the world. And I think I was struck by the way that we accept that power is a thing, that you either have it or you don't have it. And in the English language, one of the few things you do with it is wield it. And then you say, so what else do we wield in English? We wield you don't wield much, you wield a sword. You wield swords or power. And it was much like that in the Roman world, with the added extra that the word for sword in Latin, gladius, was also the word for penis. Doesn't take much to see how all this fits. Now, by saying think of power as a verb, I was being a bit naughty and I didn't really have, I can't really follow that through. But it did seem to me that if we can just get away from the idea of this zero-sum game, that some men usually have power and other people don't have power. And if we think of, when people like me and other people, when we regret some aspects of our powerlessness, I think, it would be insincere for me to say I'm completely powerless, but there's some aspects that I regret. I think what they're regretting is not whether they've got this thing called power. It's a bit like Kwame Anthony Appiah's golden nugget of civilization. You either have it or you don't. What they regret is whether people listen to them or not, whether they can get things done, whether people take them seriously, whether they can effect change. And that's a rather different way of seeing power from kind of thinking of it something that, you've got and you might have to give up one day. And I think I just want to open up that possibility of thinking, what is it to feel powerful? Well, I think it is to feel, in part, that when you open your mouth, you might not get your own way, but someone listens. And I think that that's what, if you talk to women of any race, any ethnicity, any social class, the one thing that they will all agree on is that they don't get listened to. And I think that it's putting power into that complaint, right? To be listened to is to be powerful. And let's hope it changes. It will,
The most upvoted question, thank you so much for some of these fantastic questions, is in particular about schools and young women and girls. And I just want to add as well, when Mary and I were chatting backstage, I asked about how her schedule was so jam-packed while she's here in Australia, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and she's spoken to hundreds, if not perhaps aggregate thousands of school students. And it was actually Mary's choice. She especially asked for the opportunity to speak to so many school students while she was here in Australia, which leads me to ask the most popular audience question is, what change would you like to see in schools that would help empower young women and girls?
Blimey, this is difficult because, I was brought up in single-sex education. I was educated in an all-girls school, and although Cambridge is a mixed university, I was at an all-women's college. And I have a certain sympathy with segregation, but I don't think it's a vote winner. I don't think saying let's segregate women off and educate them separately. And I think that there are downsides when you get further on. What happens when you meet the world of, male blokishness if you've been educated only with women? I think that, I would like to say, give women a bit of slack, let them, loosen up a bit.
Love this, didn't see this coming, yeah.
I mean, we're always you read articles in the newspapers all the time about, we're going to get more women into STEM, into science, we're going to get more women into this. I mean, this goes back to what I've just said, take women's aspirations seriously, open up those aspirations. One of the advantages of being at a single-sex school was I never thought science was off limits, but don't take women as a kind of problem to be solved about, where they're supposed to be or what marks they're supposed to be getting or what subjects they're supposed to be doing. Nurture them to do what the hell they want to do, right? Loosen up.
That. Who do you consider the most interesting woman in Roman history?
Oh, blimey, the most interesting woman. It's very hard to know because you're always seeing them through this fog of sexism. But if there was one woman whose writings I wish survived, it is Agrippina, who was...
Some Agrippina fans in the crowd.
Right, let's hear it for Agrippina. The wife of the Emperor Claudius, who repeatedly served him poisoned mushrooms to bring his end a bit closer, and then reputedly was the lover of her son Nero, reputedly, and then was killed by Nero. It's a wonderful moment, actually, in Agrippina's life where Nero decides to kill her by putting her out to sea in a collapsible boat. Right, he forgets that Mummy could swim. So he has to send a hit squad. She wrote her autobiography, and some ancient writers claim to have seen this and to have read it. I'm afraid it didn't make it through the Middle Ages. All those monks in the monasteries thought, we don't want that. So I don't know about Agrippina, but I'll have Agrippina's memoirs.
What's your favorite piece of ancient Roman gossip / fake news?
Oh, that's obvious. Yes, I've got an answer to that. We're going into the 3rd century CE now, and we've got a young teenage emperor on the throne. He's soon, I'm afraid, to be assassinated, and he's from Syria, and he's a bit of a puppet, probably. He invites his mates to dinner. It's really, really, good invite to the palace. And at the end of the evening, they've all had a great time. To show his generosity in ways that Romans often do, he has the ceiling opens and rose petals cascade down from the ceiling onto the guests. Only Elagabalus doesn't know where to stop. He's a 14-year-old. Sorry if there's any 14-year-olds in the audience.
Not all 14-year-olds.
Not all 14-year-olds don't know where to stop. And I'm afraid the guests smother and die. I would be prepared to bet it never happened. But there's a big message there, which is, when Roman emperors are trying to be generous, they can kill you.
The next question, I love this one. Would you be able to talk a bit about Roman masculinity and femininity and how it may be different to our modern conceptions of masculinity and femininity?
I think we've inherited quite a few of our conceptions of masculinity and femininity from the Romans. So there's quite a lot of overlap. I think what I would say is that it's very easy from that, I think, to get the impression that Romans were kind of absolute untrammeled blokes, right? That this was a version of toxic masculinity that was never toxic. That to be a Roman, and Roman, it sort of gives it away, was to be a man, and it was to think of oneself in a state of permanent, active penetration, really is what it is to be. Why else? Go to Pompeii and there's phalluses all over the floor, they're in top of the bread oven, right? And you kind of think, this is unself-conscious, phallocracy, right? And I think that is one side of it. But I think that why I've kept going with the Romans, really, because if that's all it was, it would be pretty dreary. Why I've kept going with them is, of course, they're uncertain about that too. And that, in a way, the flooding the world with phalluses was about male self-confidence, but it was also about male anxiety. It was about, are we really as powerful? What is the male symbol? And they wondered as much as we wonder about where the division lay between male and female and what it was to be a real man. And they told stories that revealed that to be problematic. The most famous story from Greek mythology, but also told in Roman myth, was the myth of Tiresias, who was the one person in the world who had been, in Roman myth, Greco-Roman mythology, both male and female. So after Tiresias had experienced being both a man and a woman, they asked Tiresias which had a better time in sex. And of course, everybody thought that Tiresias was bound to say it was men. Tiresias answered, women. And that must have been very surprising. But it's one of those little chinks where you see Romans wondering about male supremacy, male enjoyment, male power. The one person in the world who's been both a man and a woman is prepared to come up, mythologically that is, and say women enjoy sex more than men.
Wow. I'm making an executive decision that we will go one more question over time. Sorry, Opera House. And it's the question I'd like to finish with. So the question from the audience is, what are some of the research topics that you feel are in need of more and more thorough exploration? And the flavour I would like to give that for us to finish on is, what do you hope to see for the future of your discipline?
I hope, for the future of the discipline, I hope to see it realising something of its own fragility and being a bit more modest. There is a kind of sense, and it goes back to classical civilization and the well springs of the West, that I hope we kind of unseat that sense. That the whole of what we value in culture goes back to the Romans. No, it doesn't. The Romans were absolute bastards in many respects, completely horrible, and try the Colosseum if you want to know quite how horrible it is. And I think that is changing. I think people are looking, they're looking outside, and they have done for some decades now, outside the old white men who these guys think about 15 times a day. And they're seeing that ancient culture is a wonderful mixture and a very productive mixture of different ethnicities, different genders, you name it. It's a mess. It's a wonderful, productive mess, like most cultures are. And I hope that we go on exploring that. Will that do?
Absolutely.
Let's explore the mess.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Bri. Brilliant.